He settles in Switzerland after being told on the train that this is a beautiful place, and in a quiet and tiny farming village called Sils Maria. And it is here where Nietzsche writes down his legacy with the creation of the books for which he is best remembered today. So it's 1881. He's between 35 and 36 years old. And the beauty of this place reaffirms his belief in an almost artistic meaning for life. And as he's taken a stroll one day, his first big idea is that, or not his first big idea, but a massive idea comes for him, which really shakes him at the core. And it's that suffering should be embraced and not avoided. Schopenhauer wants to avoid it. Religion wants you to redeem for it. Nietzsche thinks we should embrace suffering. And this is also, quite a sexy, romanticized message, which is partly why Jordan Peterson has garnered so much attention and popularity for saying the exact same message. And Nietzsche's, so I wanted to ask you, is Nietzsche the first philosopher to ever make this point specifically, that it is good to suffer and it is good to embrace the suffering?
Well, no and yes. I think not in the way you formulated the question, but he does represent an original variation, right, on that question. So I think we have to kind of back up one step. So the place of suffering in life. I mean, one kind of question is going to be, when you think about life in general, how much suffering is it that you take as the norm? Do you take suffering to be something that happens occasionally, but basically life is pretty good? In which case you have a more benevolent understanding of life. You're going to have some suffering in your life, but that's not going to be the dominating thing that you're going to point out to explain what your life is all about and what's meaningful about it. So you have a benevolent, optimistic understanding of life. Or you can make the judgment call that overall suffering dominates in one's life, and that moments of satisfaction and happiness are relatively minor. You'll occasionally have a picnic day and things will seem pretty good, but ultimately suffering is the thing that dominates one's life. So there's an initial judgment call about the predominance of suffering in one's life. Now, overlaying all of that, there still is a difference between a philosophical assessment of suffering and a particular biographical assessment of suffering. So I can, for example, be someone whom life deals or gives me a raw deal. Maybe I'm born into grinding poverty, and I'm born with some sort of physical deformity that makes it very difficult, and I'm born in an oppressively political environment and so forth. But nonetheless, I say, even though those are the biographical circumstances or autobiographical circumstances of my life, I don't think that those say what life can and should be. And so even though my life has a lot of suffering in it, intellectually or cognitively, I'm still committed to the idea that life is pretty good. And that can cut the other way. There are lots of people who are in their autobiographical circumstances. They're born into prosperous economic circumstances. They have very good health. They live in a very free society. Nonetheless, they are convinced, psychologically, that philosophically life is pointless and meaningless, right, and full of suffering and so forth. So I think all of that would need to be teased out. So where we get, though, in the Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and I think not quite as strongly, but to a significant extent in Jordan Peterson, whom you mentioned along the way, is a fundamentalist, not in any religious sense, but a fundamentalist tragic sense of life in which suffering is the dominant feature of one's life, and that also in suffering, not only in your personal autobiographical assessment, but that suffering is in some sense the most philosophically important and or philosophically revelatory aspect of one's life that one needs to attend to. And then one's reaction in that context to what your philosophy and your ethics of life is going to be, more specifically, is to be sorted out. So we can say, for example, by contrast to religious views of life, you mentioned those along the way. You might say, this life in the physical world is dominated by physical suffering, physical disappointments, social disappointments, moral disappointments in my own self. But nonetheless, there is a possibility of an ultimately benevolent, beautiful place in heaven. And so ultimately, that person then metaphysically is still an optimist because they believe that the final story is going to be an optimistic one. It's just that this
Makes it all
particular
worthwhile.
one is dominated by so. That's right. And they also then, to get more close to your specific question here, will then say that there is a value in suffering, that partly suffering is to teach you a lesson, that this life is not really the important realm. And so, to the extent that you expect to find value in this world, you're going to be frustrated, but that's teaching you the point that you're looking in the wrong place to find value. And so suffering is a useful corrective to try to direct your energies in the proper direction. And then more strongly, the people who live an ascetic life for religious reasons, think of extreme nuns and extreme monks and those who go and live in the desert and practice mortification of the flesh. The idea there is that what you're doing is going to war against the natural world, which is ultimately the source of suffering. And to the extent that you can suffer as much as possible, in some sense, you will break your earthly bounds. And also at the same time, you will prove your worthiness to be redeemed to the higher world ultimately. So you'll get a breakthrough by going through as much suffering as you possibly can. And that's a kind of religious redemptive understanding of suffering. Now Schopenhauer, of course, is different there because he doesn't believe that there is any sort of supernatural redemption that is possible. Instead, he does think that there's an imperative to intellectual honesty, to recognize the world as it actually is. But at the same time, he believes that to the extent that you are intellectually honest and you realize just how tragic and ultimately meaningless rather the world actually is, it is intolerable. Human beings cannot bear that. And so your choice really is to wish that you had never been born, or given that you had been born, to try perhaps to summon the courage to commit suicide and to end your suffering. And then if you can't quite bring yourself to do that, then all you can do is find some sort of escapes from it, perhaps, and this is back to the art thesis as well, or the music thesis as well. Find some sort of releases where you are, you're in an alternative reality that is still giving you hints of the way reality is ultimately, but is making it at least tolerable. It's a kind of palliative along the way. Now, Nietzsche wants to resist both of those temptations, to the flights to the supernatural as a redemption for suffering, and any sort of ultimately just giving into suffering and wishing for suicide. And so what he wants to argue is that suffering and people being able to embrace suffering and endure a certain amount of suffering can strengthen you, that it can bring with you not only a physical discipline. So right now I'm thinking of the no pain, no gain physicalist understanding. Right, the more pain you endure physically, the stronger your body is going to get. But the same thing on the psychological side. The more suffering and pain that you can train yourself to take on and endure, and then ultimately transcend, that's going to make you into the kind of person who can ultimately become creative in some positive sense.